Welcome back, everybody, to the Little Less Fear podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lino Martinez. I'd like to introduce Dr. Doug Garland. We're going to be talking about the tall poppy syndrome. I had no idea what this was even all about. He briefly gave me a little synopsis about it, but I've got a lot of questions. But before I have any questions, I'm going to let him tell us, the audience, what is the tall poppy syndrome and how did you hear about it? Just give us a history on it.
So the tall poppy syndrome is seeing a field of poppies and you see a poppy taller than the rest. And the human tendency is to cut that poppy down so that all are equal. That's in essence, but of course it's a much more complex metaphor than that, but that's the first understanding you have to have. Now, in the English-speaking countries, the prevalence of the tall poppy syndrome lies in Australia. That was an egalitarian country founded on prisoners. That's where England sent their prisoners. That's how the country was founded. And it's because of that equity within the prison system that became the underlying culture of the country. And that country adheres to that to this day. So when I was doing my observational research on the tall poppy syndrome, it was based mostly in the English-speaking language on Australia and in the egalitarian countries of the Nordic, of Sweden, Finland, and Norway, because they're very egalitarian too. Now they actually have a law. They have the law of Jante, G-A-N-T-E. That is 10 commandments of how not to grow tall. So that's their pervasive culture as well, that you want to fit in with society. So I use those two extremes or two extreme parts of the world to learn a lot about the tall poppy syndrome and the makeup of what I call the cutter. The cutter is the one that calls the tall poppy down. Now, my brief history and how this all evolved was I was orthopedic surgeon, clinical professor of orthopedics at USC, and running a rehabilitation service in Los Angeles, specifically a spinal cord injury service, one of the largest in the world. I also at that time was the president of the American Spinal Injury Association. I was on tap to go to Australia to give an overview of their 6 rehabilitation programs within the country, 1 week each at each one. And I'd gone to a meeting for the Spinal Injury Association to present, but also to kind of firm up that commitment. Mm-hmm. When I got back to Los Angeles, I went to go in my room, my office, which was the large corner office with the view. And there was a note on it that my office had been moved down the hall to a cubby hole.
Oh, wow.
And I went home to my wife. I explained what happened, and she said, well, you know, they've just moved your cheese. Your days are over.
Oh, no.
So that was really good advice. She has really good emotional intelligence. Otherwise, I probably would have gone into a pissing contest and tried to go back and find out who did it and win my office back. So I called the people in Australia and I told them I wasn't coming and they wanted to know why. And I explained what was happening. And they said, my goodness, you've been tall poppy. And so that's how I was in it. I mean, I'd never heard of that word either. So that's how I learned about the tall poppy syndrome, was directly from Australia. I finished out my private practice. I quit the rehabilitation center. And I had that concept in my mind for the final years of my professional practice, kind of wondering what that was all about. So then when I retired, then I had time to research it. And we'll talk about what I found, but do you have any questions at this time specifically before we?
Well, I remember watching a documentary, and I'm not sure if it was British history or Ireland history or Scottish history, but there was something along the lines of if somebody was taller than the king, they would chop his head off. And so it's almost making sense that the originations of this idea and just how it probably has carried on throughout our history. So I'm thinking and
Well,
thinking
you're
and
getting good.
processing.
You're getting very, very warm because England is very aware of the tall poppy syndrome. And of course, if you follow the kingdoms, think of Henry VIII, that's all he did was lop off the opposition's head.
Mm-hmm.
So all kingdoms do it. All the ism countries do it. Because any opposition, communism doesn't want any opposition. So any tall poppy, any tall person who looks like a threat to the country or the kingship or leadership, they're going to get cut down. So,
Well, good thing I'm only 5 feet tall.
well, I'm not much taller, but anyway, Holland's word for it is metaphor is the tall tree captures all the wind. In Japan, it's the protruding nail gets pounded down. So when I started my research, my premise was, why in America don't we know about it? That was one premise. And I was going to look for specifically at individualism and see, because that's so unique to our country, that perhaps that was preventing it. But first I wanted to get to the roots, and so I started in ancient Greece, and it was described by Herodotus, the great Greek historian. He used heads of wheat instead of the poppies. But he said if you cut the heads of the wheat off and you were in governing, that anybody that was in opposition, you could tall poppy them. So that was the first description by Herodotus in ancient Greece. And when you think about it, just like you were doing with England, Socrates was tall poppy. Mm-hmm. So the next country we look at is ancient Rome. Livy was the great ancient Rome historian, and he described the syndrome perfectly. He described the actual tall poppy syndrome. Now, Rome was founded 750 years BC. There were 7 kingdoms. It was originally a kingdom. When the kingdom was in 500 BC, it became a republic. The last king was Tarquin the Proud. That's a very key point, the Proud. Tarquin killed all the other senators when he assumed the kingship. He actually killed the preceding king. He killed the other senators that voted against him. And when his son went to the next town, Sextus, to govern it, he had difficulty. Sextus sent a messenger back to his dad to tell him how he needed to govern. And Tarquin the Proud went out into a poppy field and lopped all the tall poppies off. Wow. The messenger went back and told Sextus. Now, this is also very important. Sextus then knew what to do, and he did it. He also raped one of the citizens' wife, Lust, and that was the wife's husband was a soldier, and he joined forces with Brutus, not the Caesar Brutus, but everybody was named Brutus at that time. And Brutus and he eventually tall poppied the king. Brutus was actually the nephew of the king. He had had problems with his sister. He killed Brutus's brother. Mm-hmm. Brutus was also a tall poppy, a threat. And between those two gentlemen, they tall poppied the king and they killed Sextus. Mm-hmm. So that's a beautiful example of the tall poppy syndrome in ancient Rome. And then, of course, if you think about it, Caesar was tall poppied. So I looked through all countries, all periods of time, and I found the tall poppy syndrome everywhere. All cultures have it. They have words for it, or they have metaphors, but not America. So then I dived into an analysis of the Americas. So that's what we'll do now, if it's okay with you.
It is. Other thoughts are going through my head that there's other forms of this tall poppy, like narcissistic behaviors.
Well, it's the narcissist that's going to be bad behavior, and the poppy, he's going to get cut, he or she's going to get cut down because of their bad behavior, and people feel they don't deserve their position in life. So you're right, the narcissist is frequently a tall poppy. He's also the one that gets cut down.
Eventually.
Yes. If you give them enough rope, they're going to cut themselves down.
So I'm curious how you related this to you going from the beautiful office with the beautiful view to like the little corner. Like how were you tall poppied if you weren't being the unless you were being a narcissistic and you weren't aware of it? I mean, I'm not.
No, I was very aware of it the whole time I would practice there. I was in private practice, and the hospital I was at was a county facility in LA.
Yeah, my father actually worked at county for 13 years. He's a retired physician. I know the area pretty well.
So always in the medical system, there's a problem between administration and the doctors. The doctors want this and the administrators want that. So there's always a tension, I'll say mostly, in most hospitals, there's a certain intrinsic tension between the two. That's the duel that I always talk about, the competition. The worst problem was I was a volunteer.
Oh,
So
wow.
I wasn't on the payroll. I wasn't part of the county system. So if I really had no control over people, but because I think I was very good at the job, I published over 110 scientific peer-reviewed articles. I was a real expert in spinal cord injury and the care of the spinal cord injury patient. When I had my monthly conference, there were 30 physicians that attended, and almost all of them were county employees.
Hmm.
They always, I mean, I was a volunteer. They were volunteering to come to my meeting because they knew I had the patient, was concerned for the patient's welfare.
Hmm.
So that created actually another potential problem. So there were just a couple administrators that just didn't like me for, as I say, that intrinsic thing. So, and that had happened all along, but nobody had ever called me on it. So finally, after 30 years, I was called on it. And my wife was very smart. She told me what to do. I went in the next day, put the key on the desk. I threw all my slides away, all the papers I had published, all the meetings that we had held. I mean, I put that county hospital on the map, helped put it on the map. And I showed them what it meant to me. It was volunteer work. It was not my vocation.
Bless
And
your
I
heart.
threw it in a wastebasket and I left. That was the end of it. But fortunately, because of my wife, as I said, I would have gotten into a big pissing contest about
Oh
it.
yeah, so would I. Definitely.
Yeah, right. So that's the normal reaction. And I also learned through all my research that there's a saying, if you seek revenge, dig two graves. Because as a revenger, you have to work harder at getting even than the person that started it. And that's going to end very poorly for you, just
I have
like
to
Will
write this
Smith.
down. If you seek revenge, dig two graves. Wow.
Well, and the other
So
saying,
true.
the other saying is revenge is a dish best served cold, meaning that you need to, when it occurs to you, I mean, Will Smith would not be in the problem he's in if
Right.
he would have just stepped back 2 seconds and not try to cut Chris Rock down.
Right. Definitely.
Yeah, so that was pride. Will Smith had a lot of pride. He had anger, and then he sought revenge. And now
Those are part of the seven deadly sins that you
right.
also talk about.
So
Can
let
we
me
talk
go.
yeah, can we talk
So
about
let me
that?
go into that. So when I analyzed the motives of the cutter and the cuttee, so in order for the tall poppy syndrome to occur, you have to have two people, duels, so to speak. You have to have somebody cut the tall poppy down. And the first thing I had to work through was that the tall poppy syndrome happens mostly to people that aren't tall poppies. So it happens in your family, it happens in your neighborhood, it happens in your school, and it happens in your place of work.
Happens
And that's what I call the peer-to-peer tall poppy syndrome. And when we analyze that group of people, it's mostly driven by bad envy. You know, envy is divided into two groups. Good envy is emulation. So if you're a handsome guy, maybe I'll grow a beard. beginning tomorrow morning. So
That's more like a healthy envy.
right, that's healthy envy. And then bad envy is, well, I haven't reached puberty yet. I can't grow a beard yet. So I'll just disparage you and say, that's an ugly beard you have. Why do you wear that? So mostly peer-to-peer tall poppy syndrome occurs with bad envy. You covet what the other person has, but you can't achieve it. So you not only want to sometimes destroy what they have, but you want to destroy their happiness. That's the most common cause of the tall poppy syndrome, peer-to-peer. The second most common is anger, just as happened to Will Smith. And then the third, and to a much lesser degree, laziness. You don't want to work hard to improve yourself. Your neighbor has a better home. You're just too lazy to do a little bit of work to clean it up, to paint it, or whatever it takes. So those are the three main emotions found in the cutter. Now, when you look at it, that's 3 of the 7 deadly sins. Then when we analyze the true tall poppies, and once again, we have plenty of tall poppies in America, more than anywhere else in the world, probably combined. And so when you look at their behavior, why they get cut down is pride, number one, far and away, way more common than anything else. And for you to remember that is when the psychiatrist walks into his client's room, and it's a male in there, and he says, "You got daddy issues or pride issues?" And that sums up, and actually a lot of daddy issues are pride issues as well.
Right.
So pride is the number one far and away, but closely followed is lust and greed. So that's 3 more of the 7 deadly sins. So within my metaphor of the tall poppy syndrome, it's driven by the 7 deadly sins. And the only one we didn't mention is gluttony. And so that's a handle for people to remember, one, what the tall poppy syndrome is, and the emotions that drive it. And if you're observing it, just like I did on Will Smith, you then have to reflect on those 7 deadly sins and then think, well, what's my own bias in it? So I don't know if it was 50-50, but there were people, I thought Will Smith was completely wrong. His actions were egregious and he got what he deserved. Right. But there were plenty of people that stuck up for Will Smith. I mean, if you went on the internet, there were people that thought he was all right, thought it was okay, that Chris Rock deserved it for making fun of his wife.
It's never okay to react that
well,
way.
I agree with you, but I'm just telling you, if you look at the
yeah,
internet,
I did read some of these quotes on Twitter. It's amazing.
So that made up the study, and when I then analyzed my premise for why it wasn't in America, it was wrong. I mean, I felt it was more prevalent here. Individualism and meritocracy in the peer-to-peer made it so because there's so much competition in school, in your family, in your workplace. And then the other 7 for the public, where we have so many tall poppies here, so especially Hollywood, which kind of is a narcissistic society as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
So we have so many tall poppies here, so of course it's going to be common here. So I concluded that it was more common in America than it was the rest of the world, and it was my job to tell everybody that. But the last thing about that I want to talk, and I'll give you the mic again, that I want to mention is a word called Schadenfreude. That's a German word. It's 2 words. The Germans have a nice way of expanding their vocabulary. They just add another word. So they actually have words that are 3 words that they've just been added together. So Schadenfreude is harm and joy. And what that means is people feel good when somebody else suffers some pain. So once again, in the Will Smith, Chris Rock episode, when Chris Rock was slapped, and Will Smith then shouted out some profanities and things. You know, he really acted out, and I think he lost a lot of support. And then if you read the internet, um, there was a lot of Schadenfreude. They were happy that Will Smith got called out for his bad actions.
Hmm.
So frequently, not only, it's kind of like I mentioned, bad envy, not only is coveting something, but it's wanting to destroy the person's happiness.
Right.
So to a certain extent, that's what Schadenfreude is all about as well. And it's frequently the end of the cutting down process. So that's sort of the cycle of it. And if you understand the syndrome, you really understand the world. You understand past history. You understand, in my book, I put Cain and Abel in the Bible is really bad envy, coveting, and cutting the brother down. And if you're an Acts and look at Stephen was the first person who became a martyr after the crucifixion, and Christ rises from the dead. So then the apostles went out to spread the word. And Stephen is stoned to death. He was preaching about Christ, and of course they thought that was blasphemy, and so they stoned him to death.
Right.
So in the Bible actually is full of the tall poppy syndrome, but it actually helps you understand the Bible, history, our country, your neighbors, your own. And once you understand, you're self-reflecting. And anytime you do a research paper, you learn more than anybody else. And I learned more about myself doing this. That was really quite enlightening.
I can imagine so. And I can also imagine that a lot of this is also ingrained in survival of the fittest. So
Yes,
I
very.
wonder, at what point does somebody actually take control of what's biological and are able to make that change and to stop this? I'm not sure if it's ever going to end, but I think that it can get better.
Well, for us, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, when I look at it, we are a country of survival of the fittest,
Mm-hmm.
even though we didn't describe it, but
Right.
that's our country, and that's more of our culture than everybody else. So that's why I thought it was more prominent here. And I mean, it was the rugged individualism of the Old West where we live. And for me, it's since the West has been settled, it's becoming more and more modified. And you don't hear the term rugged individualism as much.
Right.
So times are changing, and we are trying to throttle the fittest to a certain extent. I mean, that's kind of a war going on now, the flipping and changing of equality versus equity.
Oh yeah.
But that's really happening. It's a big struggle in America now. But in the end, all this cancel culture, I think it's not good. We need heroes. Heroes are what drives the world.
Yeah.
We wouldn't advance without tall poppies.
Right.
So for me, tall poppies are good. We need to nurture. I mean, that's what valedictorians used to be about, and I mean, schools giving scholarships to the brightest people because they want to encourage that person.
Yes.
So in essence, that's who drives things potentially for the better. We just need them not to be so prideful sometimes. So
Exactly.
that's unfortunately that's what happens.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so I call it, emotional intelligence. There's, the argument that IQ is not a real measure of the person. And Dan Goldman back in '95 had his kind of breakthrough novel, Emotional Intelligence. And I agree with a lot with what he says, that it's the emotionally stable person that's best. So how do you have just like my wife knowing exactly and telling me what to do.
Mm-hmm.
She was far better equipped than I was. I already was in my survival of the fittest and
Yeah.
flight or fright.
Your
Well,
flight and
that's what,
fight response was taken
yeah,
off.
right. I mean, emotions, they're emotions, but one of the things that emotion does is to create the action. Emotion is a mental process,
Exactly.
but they drive a reaction. So, it's the survival of the fittest reaction that it frequently drives. So those tall poppies need to be well aware of that and to be able to control that reflex. And it was much easier. I mean, it's always easier looking. It's kind of like looking at a wedding and they're walking down the aisle and you're thinking, this is never going to work. It's always
Yeah.
easy to see it in somebody else than yourself. So the idea of the tall poppy syndrome for me personally is to actually visualize it, but reflect on your own behavior. Are you the cutter or the cuttee? And you have to draw that fine line between the
I love
two.
that. Are you the
And
cutter or the cuttee?
yeah, right.
Dr. Garland, you mentioned you also wrote a book about this. Where can we find your book, and how can our viewers, our watchers, and our listeners find you?
So DOUGGARLAND.com. That's my website. And there's a lot of information on the website. And the book is on Amazon.com. And then just type in the tall poppy syndrome and it'll come up. And if they have questions, there's really some outstanding reviews, very, very intellectually satisfying reviews for the book. And we just did the audio last week, and I have to say it's fantastic. No,
Excellent.
it's really a good job. The guy that read the book was just wonderful. I wish I could have done it myself.
Thanks so much for being on A Little Less Fear podcast. You've definitely shed a lot of light with the tall poppy syndrome. I'm glad that I more aware of on the tall poppy syndrome. Definitely know what's going on there, and I can see how it's messed up America for sure. But I do think we're on the mend, slowly but surely, and people like you are definitely making a positive shift. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Hope to see you again
We
too.
will meet again. Thank you.
All right. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.